Welcome the anointed ones. The truth doesn't need defense, it just needs time, and a witness with the guts to speak it out loud. Let's get something straight. You didn't ruin anybody's peace. You simply exposed the fact that their peace was a performance. And now that the stage lights are off, their whole act is falling apart. Here's a little-known psychological fact. People don't fear being exposed because you're wrong. They fear it because you're right, and your accuracy threatens the version of reality they depend on. And let's be honest, at first they were chuckling, mocking you in group chats, side eyes at the family function, pretending like you were just doing too much. But now, they're sweating in silence. Why? Because everything you called out is happening, on schedule, with receipts. And now suddenly, your overreactions are looking like prophecies. Your drama is looking like discernment. And their laughter, it aged like expired almond milk. Not so funny now, huh? This is the emotional audit. You were the mirror, and they couldn't handle the reflection. So buckle up, because today we're diving deep into the spiral you didn't cause, but absolutely predicted. Let's talk about what happens when the chosen one stops biting their tongue and starts speaking thunder. Number 1, they laughed when you spoke truth, until their own lives became the punchline. They laughed hard. When you spoke up, when you told the truth, when you called out what no one else had the courage to say, they laughed like you were the joke. They mocked you behind your back, snickered in circles you used to sit in, and labeled you as doing too much, making stuff up, or always trying to be deep. They made your truth sound like a comedy routine. But here's the twist. They're not laughing anymore. Now their life is the punchline. Every single thing you warned about, everything you pointed out, every behavior you said would come back around, it's all showing up, and not quietly. It's crashing into their world with no disguise. You didn't curse them, you didn't have to. You just saw clearly, and now they're living in the mess they swore didn't exist. The same people who called you crazy are now gasping behind closed doors because your words keep echoing in real time. The consequences you tried to help them avoid have become their new reality. They used laughter to avoid accountability, but truth doesn't need validation to stand tall. It just waits. And now that it's arrived, they're choking on the very sarcasm they used to bury your voice. You weren't trying to embarrass them. You weren't trying to be right just to flex. You were trying to bring light to things that were hurting everyone in the dark. But they turned it into entertainment because they didn't want to change. It's easier to mock the messenger than to face the message. But life has a wild way of humbling people, especially when they've built their confidence on denial. Now the silence is heavy, the jokes are stale, and the same truth they laughed at is sitting on their chest like a brick. They thought they were clever, thought they could twist your warnings into comedy. But the real joke? It's that they needed you more than they were ever willing to admit. Now the only thing funnier than their original reaction is how badly they wish they had taken you seriously. But it's too late. Your truth stood the test of time, and they're stuck with the consequences, no laugh track included. Number 2, you disrupted the ecosystem of their delusion. You didn't just call people out, you shook the entire setup they were surviving in. The moment you spoke the truth, you weren't just confronting one person. You were disrupting an entire ecosystem built on unspoken agreements, fake alliances, silent cover-ups, and mutual delusions. These people weren't just individuals being messy. They were part of a system where everyone played a role. And the number 1 rule was, never tell the truth too loudly. You didn't just say, that's not right. You said, all of this is a lie. And that's when things got dangerous. Because in that moment, you became the threat, not to a person, but to the whole system. That workplace culture where everyone knows who's toxic but pretends otherwise? You ruined it. That family dynamic where people pretend we're close while hiding secrets and silent resentments? You cracked it. That friend group built on gossip, trauma bonding, and status games, you made it obvious and uncomfortable they were all living under the same false peace. That kind of peace that only works when everyone agrees to pretend. And you? You refused. You refused to play dumb, you refused to gaslight yourself. You refused to stay silent for the sake of keeping the vibe chill. And for that, you got labeled difficult, dramatic, unstable. But really, you were just the first one willing to stop pretending. They were never mad at you for being wrong. They were mad that your truth broke their unspoken pact to stay asleep. You brought a kind of clarity that was too raw, too honest, too clean for a dirty system to survive next to. That's why they started turning on you. That's why they isolated you. You weren't the problem. You were the interruption. You walked in with truth and everything built on lies started to shake. You didn't just disturb the peace, you proved there wasn't any. And now they're spiraling, not because of what you said, but because everything you exposed made it impossible for them to go back to pretending. You disrupted the whole game, and that's why they'll never forget what you did. Number 3, you were the mirror. But they mistook you for a weapon. They thought you were the problem. They really did. They thought calling you too deep or too intense would shut you up. But the truth is, you weren't attacking them. You were just being a mirror. That's all. You stood there in your natural state, unfiltered, honest, and spiritually awake, and it shook their core. Not because you did something wrong, but because for the first time, someone saw them clearly, and that terrified them. You reflected everything they were trying to hide, the bitterness they dressed up as strength, the jealousy they masked with fake compliments, the lies they told themselves so they could keep feeling good about what they did to people like you. You didn't expose them with a megaphone. You exposed them by just being. That was the threat. That was the offense. You didn't have to raise your voice or pull receipts. Your energy was the evidence. They weren't ready for someone who could see through the carefully built facade they curated for the world. You saw their survival strategies, their projections, their manipulation, their desperate need to control how people perceive them, and you named it, calmly, casually, point blank. They didn't hate you because you lied. They hated you because you were honest without effort, because you didn't need to play games to gain power. You already had something they couldn't manufacture: authenticity. That kind of presence is threatening in a world where people survive by pretending. And so they flipped it. They called you the enemy. They acted like you were starting drama, like you were unstable, like you were overthinking everything. But deep down they knew. They felt that heat of exposure. And now that the effects of their own decisions are spiraling out in public, your name is echoing in their heads. Not as a curse, but as the confirmation they tried to run from. You weren't the weapon. You were the mirror. But in a world full of illusions, sometimes a reflection is more dangerous than a blade. That's why they're spiraling now. You didn't destroy them. They're finally seeing who they really are without all the noise, and it's tearing them apart. Number 4, you triggered their fake identity crisis. They spent years crafting an identity that would keep them accepted, praised, and in control. It wasn't who they really were. It was who they needed to be to stay relevant, admired, and safe in their illusion. Every part of that version of themselves was designed for effect. The way they talked, the values they claimed to have, even the pain they performed. It was all curated. A character built to survive the eyes of others. And then you came along, raw, unfiltered, honest to the bone. And suddenly their mask didn't stand a chance. You didn't even try to compete. That's what shook them. You weren't chasing attention. You weren't asking for validation. You weren't performing like they were. You were just real. And that alone exposed how fake their whole identity had become. They weren't ready for that level of contrast. It made them question everything. How much of their personality was even authentic? How much of their image was built on lies they convinced themselves were true? You didn't break them. You revealed them. And that's what's causing the spiral. Because when someone builds their entire identity on performance, and then they're faced with someone who simply is, without effort, they feel naked, powerless, seen in ways they didn't ask for. You didn't ruin their life. You ruined the illusion they were addicted to, and now, every room they walk into, they feel the difference. You left an imprint. They feel exposed. Not because you aired their secrets, but because your presence exposes what's missing in theirs: substance. They've built a brand of self that looks good, but can't stand next to truth. And now, That mask is slipping. The things they used to do for attention don't hit like they used to. The manipulation isn't landing. The praise feels emptier. You triggered the identity crisis they swore they'd never have to face. You didn't take anything from them, they're just realizing they never really had it. That's what they can't handle. That's why they're unraveling. Because you didn't expose their flaws. You exposed their fiction. Number 5. Your clarity was misread as arrogance until reality verified you. They couldn't understand how you saw through things so quickly, so they labeled you arrogant. They couldn't grasp how your instincts kept hitting the nail on the head, so they dismissed you as dramatic. And when you refused to downplay your insight just to make them comfortable, they called it ego. But the truth is, you weren't arrogant. You were clear. You didn't need proof to believe what your spirit already confirmed. You didn't need evidence to recognize patterns your soul had seen 1,000 times before. You weren't trying to be better than anyone. You were just done pretending you didn't see what was clearly wrong. You didn't play along with their illusions. And that threatened the fragile image they had of themselves as smarter, wiser, or more in control. Your discernment disrupted their hierarchy. You didn't wait for disaster to believe what your gut told you from day one, and that kind of confidence in inner truth. It scares people who depend on external approval to feel valid, so they tried to humble you by mocking you. They told others you were paranoid, that you were reaching, that you thought you were better than everybody else. But now the storm is here, and everything you said in passing, every warning you gave, every truth they waved off, is happening exactly as you said it would. And they don't know how to deal with that. They're sitting in the wreckage of their denial, choking on the silence you left behind. Your clarity wasn't arrogance, it was accuracy, it was alignment. And now their fake sense of superiority has crumbled. Not because you rubbed anything in their face, but because life did it for you. Their ego can't outrun reality anymore. What once looked like you trying to be too wise is now the blueprint they wish they listened to. They called you too much, but now they're not enough to face what's unfolding, and deep down, they know you saw it all coming, not because you're perfect, but because you were never afraid to see what others were too scared to acknowledge. That's not arrogance, that's rare. Number 6. You made the invisible abuse visible, and that's what broke them. You saw what others were too afraid to name. The subtle digs masked as jokes, the manipulation wrapped in concern, the guilt-tripping disguised as love. You watched the emotional blackmail, the silent treatments, the selective kindness that only showed up when someone was useful. And while everyone else played along for the sake of keeping the peace, you had the nerve to call it what it was, abuse, plain and simple. You didn't need bruises to believe it was real. You didn't wait for screaming to know it was violence. You saw the control in the silence, the emotional currency in every favor, the way entire family or social dynamics revolved around one person's need to be right, adored, or feared. That unspoken rule, never confront them, never expose them, never threaten their image. You broke it with one truth. This isn't love, this is manipulation. And that's when it all started to fall apart. Because what they relied on wasn't power, it was secrecy. Their control only worked as long as no one had the courage to see it for what it was. Once you said it out loud, the illusion cracked, and suddenly, all the things they used to get away with felt obvious. Their tactics stopped working. Their stories stopped making sense. And now they're spiraling, not because you did anything wrong, but because you dragged the truth out into the light and left no room to hide. They thought their titles would protect them. That's just how moms are. He's the man of the house. She means well. But you weren't fooled by that. You saw the performance, the fear-based obedience, the emotional exhaustion that everyone else normalized. And when you stopped playing along, you forced everyone else to wake up too. That's what broke them. You didn't expose them to outsiders. You exposed them to themselves. And now they can't unsee it. They can't undo it. Their false sense of power depended on your silence. And you took that away without shouting, just by telling the truth. And now the whole structure is trembling because you named what they built their identity around hiding. Number 7. You're the unpaid historian of every dysfunction they denied. You didn't let it slide. You didn't forget. You didn't conveniently rewrite history the way they hoped you would. That's what makes you dangerous in their eyes. You're the walking, breathing, unpaid historian of every lie they told, every mask they wore, every twisted version of the truth they tried to sell to others, and even to themselves, while they moved on like nothing happened. While they played innocent, while they dressed up their past in false innocence, you remembered it all. You didn't hold a grudge, you held the receipts, and not the petty kind, the kind rooted in truth. You kept the details, the exact words they used when they manipulated you, the moment they turned on you for telling the truth, the silence when you needed them the most. You remember that family event where the betrayal happened in plain sight and everyone acted like it was normal. You remember who watched, who smiled, who stayed quiet. And that memory, that's their nightmare. They thought time would erase it. That if they smiled long enough, acted holy enough, performed healed enough, it would disappear. But your memory is the crack in their performance. You're the reason they can't fully rebrand. You're the one witness they can't silence, shame, or erase. And the fact that you still carry those truths without bitterness but with clarity terrifies them. Because you weren't just present, you were aware. While everyone else was gaslighting themselves to keep the peace, you were storing every moment of dysfunction they tried to bury. You weren't just a target of the mess, you became the archive of it. That's why they attack your credibility. That's why they downplay your emotions, call you sensitive, or say you remember things wrong. Because if people believe you, their whole narrative collapses. You didn't ask for that role, but you own it now. Not out of revenge, but because someone had to carry the unedited version of the truth. And since they won't confess and others won't admit, you became the quiet historian of what really went down. That's why they're spiraling. Because you are the proof they can't control, the memory they can't rewrite, and the one person who will never let them fake their way into innocence. Number 8. Your voice turned into a verdict. You weren't ranting, you weren't being bitter, and you definitely weren't seeking revenge. When you spoke, it wasn't just you talking. It was like the whole spiritual courtroom paused to listen. Every time you named what they tried to hide, every time you exposed the power games, the silent manipulation, the gaslighting, something in the unseen realm moved. Because when a chosen one speaks truth from a clean place, it's not gossip. It's a verdict. They thought they were being clever. They thought they could spin the story, manipulate the optics, and keep their hands looking clean. But your voice cut through all of that. You didn't need to scream. You didn't need to curse. You just called it what it was, and that was enough to trigger judgment. It was spiritual court in session, and your truth was the gavel. The moment you opened your mouth, masks started to fall. The lies started to rot. Relationships started to crumble. Not because you were plotting, but because you were aligned. You didn't speak from ego. You spoke from clarity. And that's the difference. You weren't trying to punish them. You were simply refusing to lie for them anymore. And that is what shifted the energy. People often think karma is this far-off thing that shows up 10 years later in dramatic fashion. But sometimes it starts immediately after someone's been exposed by the one they underestimated. You didn't wish them harm. You just spoke the truth they swore no one would ever have the guts to say. And once it was out in the open, the spiritual scales tipped. You didn't have to lift a finger. You just had to tell the truth out loud. And that alone sent ripple effects through their life. Now, everything they used to control others is turning back on them. Their charm is collapsing. Their manipulation isn't working. Their reputation is falling apart. Not because you did anything, but because divine order responded to your voice. And now, it's not a conversation anymore. It's a sentence. Case closed. Number 9. They needed you silent, not because you were wrong, but because you were too right. They didn't cast you out because you were off. They cast you out because you were on point. Too much so. You weren't silenced because you were spreading lies. You were silenced because you were too aligned, too insightful, too awake. You saw the motives before the moves. You read the energy in the room before anyone spoke. You caught the pattern while everyone else was still clapping, and that made you dangerous. Not because you meant harm, but because you could see too clearly. People didn't reject you because you were loud and wrong. They rejected you because you were calm, quiet, and correct. You didn't play into the fantasy, you didn't drink the Kool-Aid, and you refused to co-sign what your spirit knew was false. And that's when the walls started closing in. They didn't want your input, they wanted your silence. Not because they had facts on their side, but because they needed the lie to breathe a little longer. And your truth? It was suffocating it. You were too ahead for the room. That's not ego, that's observation. While they were laughing at surface jokes, you were catching the emotional manipulations in the pauses. While they were bonding over fake vulnerability, you were watching the control tactics behind the scenes. And when you finally spoke up, it didn't just ruffle feathers, it threatened the entire production. They needed you silent to protect their performance. They had a role they were playing, a story they were telling. And your presence alone, your honesty, your consistency, your refusal to bend, exposed how much of it was theater. You messed up the script. You interrupted the programming. You refused to let their version of events become history. And now, without your silence to protect it, their whole narrative is cracking like glass. That's why they're spiraling. Not because you harmed them, but because your voice is undoing the illusion they spent years curating. You didn't attack their character. You revealed the one they were pretending to be. And the second your truth went public, their mask started slipping. They didn't fear your lies. They feared your clarity. Number 10. They watched you endure what would have killed them. Now they fear your resilience. They watched you go through storms that would have crushed anyone else. And yet here you stand, stronger, sharper, and unbreakable. It's like they expected you to shatter, to crumble, to disappear into the background where no one would hear your truth. But instead, you turned that pain into power. That struggle became your stage, and every scar is a chapter in the story they don't want told. What terrifies them isn't just that you called out their lies, it's that you survived them. Your resilience mocks their attempts to rewrite history. They wanted a victim to control, someone weak enough to carry their narrative of blame and manipulation. But you refused to be that person. You became the living contradiction to their victim act, the undeniable proof that they were never innocent. You survived their games, their tactics, and their silence. And that alone is enough to dismantle their whole world. They're scared because your survival means their control is slipping. Your story exposes the truth behind the mask they wore, the truth they hoped no one would see. And every time you speak your truth, it invalidates their carefully constructed role as the wronged party. You're not just a survivor, you're a mirror reflecting everything they tried to hide about themselves. And mirrors don't lie. This fear isn't just about you anymore. It's about the power you hold in living through what would have destroyed them. You became stronger than their cruelty. You became the undeniable proof that their narrative was just a smokescreen. That you lived through hell and didn't just survive, you thrived. And that truth terrifies them more than any confrontation ever could. Your resilience isn't just your story, it's their reckoning. It's the reason they can't keep spinning lies or manipulating the past. Because when you stand tall, unshaken, you're not just surviving, you're rewriting the entire narrative. And that's what breaks them. They built their control like a fortress, brick by brick, story by story, carefully shaping how the world sees you. Every whisper, every half-truth, every carefully crafted lie was a weapon to keep you boxed in, misunderstood, and powerless. Their power didn't come from what they did to you directly. It came from how they twisted your image in the eyes of others. That narrative was their kingdom, and as long as they controlled it, you were trapped inside their story. But then something changed. You stopped playing by their rules. You stopped waiting for them to validate who you really were. You stopped needing their approval or their version of your identity to feel whole. The moment you took back your story, the walls of their kingdom began to crumble. You didn't just reject their lies, you rewrote the script entirely. Number 11. They're losing power because you took back perception. Taking back your perception wasn't just an act of defiance, it was a strategic dismantling of their power. You showed others the real you, the unfiltered truth, and in doing so, you shattered the illusion they worked so hard to maintain. Their carefully constructed narrative lost its grip. The fear they instilled through gossip, manipulation, and false impressions started to fade because you refused to be defined by their version anymore. That's why they're spiraling now. They're watching their influence slip through their fingers as their stories lose credibility. Their attempts to control conversations, relationships, and reputations are falling flat because you reclaimed your voice and your identity. When their version no longer dominates the room, their power evaporates. They built their power on your silence and your submission to their narrative. But by owning your story openly and unapologetically, you exposed the cracks in their control. They didn't just lose control over your story, they lost control over their entire game. And that loss is driving their panic, their desperation, and their spiral. Because once you take back perception, their power has nowhere to hide. Number 12, you burned the bridge, and now they're drowning in the river of their own lies. You made a choice they never saw coming. You walked away. Whether you cut the cord, went no contact, or simply called out the unspoken truth everyone else avoided, you left them stranded in their own chaos. For so long they leaned on you to carry the weight of their lies, guilt, and manipulation. You were the convenient target, the scapegoat who absorbed their mess while they kept pretending everything was fine. But once you stepped out, that safety net vanished. Now they're drowning in the very river of lies and blame they crafted to control the narrative. No more easy excuses, no more silent victims to blame. All the secrets, the twisted stories, and the hidden pain they buried deep have risen to the surface, and there's no one left to shove it back down. They're trapped in their own emotional mess, forced to face the consequences of what they refused to acknowledge when you were there. This isn't just about you leaving. It's about exposing the cracks in their facade so wide that even they can't ignore them anymore. They thought your silence kept the chaos manageable, but your departure flipped the script. Suddenly, their carefully constructed lies have no anchor, no scapegoat, and no cover-up. The blame that once bounced off you now rebounds with full force, and it's crushing them from the inside out. That bridge you burned wasn't just a line of communication. It was their control, their illusion of safety, and their ability to rewrite the past. Now that it's gone, they're left alone with the truth they never wanted to confront. They wanted you silent, compliant, and contained, but you chose freedom instead. And now, as they flail in the flood of their own making, they realize the cost of losing you was far greater than they ever imagined. Number 13. They thought the truth would die with you in isolation. But you became a megaphone. They expected your silence like it was guaranteed. They pushed you to the margins, spread rumors to tarnish your name, and hoped isolation would seal your lips forever. Their plan was simple: bury your truth so deep no one would hear it again. But what they didn't count on was your fire. Instead of shrinking away, you exploded onto the scene louder than ever, wiser, sharper, and impossible to ignore. Isolation was meant to silence you, but it became your amplifier. Every lie they told, every smear they spread, only fueled your determination to speak louder and clearer. You didn't just survive their attempts to erase you. You turned their rejection into a global megaphone for your truth. Where they saw an end, you found a platform. Where they hoped for whispers, you created a movement. Now the fear they feel isn't about what you said yesterday or last week. It's about the tidal wave of people who are listening right now. The truth you carry isn't just your story anymore, it's a collective awakening that's shaking their foundations, and that's why they're spiraling. Not because you made noise, but because so many others are finally hearing what they tried to silence. They thought your exile would be your defeat, but it's their undoing. You didn't just survive their attempts to erase you. You transformed your pain and your story into a megaphone that echoes louder every day. And the more they try to quiet you, the louder you become. That's what terrifies them most. The unstoppable power of a truth that refuses to be hidden any longer. Number 14. They wanted you to feel crazy. But now they're having the breakdown you were supposed to have. They played a classic trick, make you doubt your own mind so they could keep their dirty secrets safe. They called you unstable, told you were too sensitive or overreacting, anything to gaslight you into silence. The goal was clear. If you cracked first, their world stayed intact. They wanted you to break, to question your reality, to retreat and disappear quietly. But the irony? You didn't break, you healed. You grew stronger. Instead of crumbling under the pressure they tried to heap on you, you rose above it. You faced your pain head-on, reclaimed your sanity, and rebuilt your life on your terms. That's when the tables turned, and the mask they wore began to slip. Now they're the ones unraveling. The very chaos they projected onto you is consuming them from the inside. They're having the breakdown they tried to engineer for you, not because you wished it upon them or spoke curses, but because the truth you voiced, loud and clear, uncovered the cracks they tried desperately to hide. Truth, once spoken, can't be erased. It can't be unseen or unheard. Their world, built on projection and lies, can't withstand the light you shone on it. They thought labeling you crazy would keep you trapped in confusion, but instead, your clarity became the weapon that exposed their own fragility. The breakdown they feared wasn't your silence, but your awakening. And now, as they crumble, the roles are reversed. You're standing firm while they fall apart. You didn't cause their collapse. You simply spoke your truth and healed from their attack, and in that you won. At the end of the day, calling out the truth wasn't just an act of courage, it was a seismic shift. You didn't just speak words. You dismantled illusions, shattered masks, and reclaimed a power they never wanted you to have. Their spiraling isn't a sign of your failure. It's the inevitable collapse of a house built on lies and fear. What you endured and exposed isn't just your story anymore. It's a living, breathing testament to resilience, clarity, and unwavering strength. You became the mirror they feared, the voice they couldn't silence, and the storm that broke their carefully constructed calm. And through it all, you proved one undeniable fact. Truth isn't something you can cage, ignore, or erase. It's a force that transforms, awakens, and ultimately frees. So yes, they're spiraling, but that chaos is your victory, echoing loud and clear. In standing firm, you didn't just survive, you changed the entire game. And that, above all, is the real power of the chosen one. Not just to endure, but to illuminate the shadows until there's nowhere left to hide. Keep shining, keep speaking, because your truth is the reckoning they never saw coming, and it's far from over. If this message hit home and you're ready for more truth that cuts deep and shines bright, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Don't just watch, be part of the movement. Like, comment your thoughts, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Your voice matters, and together we're breaking silence, exposing lies, and owning our power. Stay woke, stay strong, and keep rising. Stay blessed.